Plague of Athens. The Plague of Athens hit in 430 BC during the Peloponnesian War, and it's one of the earliest plagues we actually have detailed records of, thanks to the historian Thucydides, who caught it himself and somehow survived to write about it. If you'd been an Athenian back then, the first thing you'd notice is a sudden burning sensation in your head. Your eyes would turn bloodshot and red, and your tongue and throat would feel like they were on fire. Within hours, you'd start sneezing violently, and your voice would go hoarse. Then it moves to your chest, a hacking cough that won't stop, followed by stomach cramps so severe that doctors back then described patients as wanting to tear their own skin off. The fever was so intense that victims would throw themselves into cisterns of cold water, desperate for relief. If you somehow made it past day 7, you'd start vomiting bile of every color imaginable. And then the real horror begins. Ulcers breaking out across your whole body, and a thirst so unquenchable nothing could satisfy it. Most people died around day 8 or 9. Those who survived often lost fingers, toes, or even their eyesight, and some lost their memory entirely, not even recognizing their own families. The worst part is, the Athenians believed the plague was sent by the gods. So, instead of quarantining, they crowded into temples to pray, which is exactly how diseases spread fastest. About a third of Athens died, including their leader, Pericles. And honestly, if anyone back then had even a basic understanding of contagion, the death toll could have been cut in half. But more on that later. Antonine Plague. The Antonine Plague struck the Roman Empire between 165 and 180 AD, and it's widely believed to have been smallpox brought back by soldiers returning from campaigns in the Near East. If you'd caught it, you'd first feel a high fever, followed by chills and a brutal headache. Then, a few days and the rash starts. Small red spots that quickly turn into fluid-filled blisters covering your face, arms, legs, and even the inside of your mouth and throat. The pustules were so painful that even lying still was agony, and if they appeared in your throat, you'd struggle to swallow or even breathe. The smell was apparently unbearable, rotting flesh mixed with pus, and victims were often abandoned by their own families out of fear. About 10% of the entire Roman Empire died from this plague, including the emperor Lucius Verus, and the Romans had absolutely no idea what was happening. They blamed Christians for angering the traditional gods and persecuted them, which obviously did nothing to stop the disease. The Antonine Plague is considered one of the major factors that started Rome's long, slow decline. Plague of Justinian. Fast forward to 541 AD, and we get the Plague of Justinian, which is now confirmed to be the first major outbreak of bubonic plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. This one's interesting because the symptoms are some of the most visually horrifying of any disease ever. First, you'd get a fever and feel exhausted. Then, within a day or two, the buboes appear, massive swollen lymph nodes in your armpits, neck, and groin that would grow to the size of an egg or even an apple. They'd turn black, purple, and start oozing pus. The pain was reportedly so intense that victims would scream non-stop or fall into a kind of mad delirium. Some people developed gangrene in their fingers and toes, which would turn black and fall off. This is actually where the term Black Death comes from. Later on, if the infection reached your lungs, which it often did, you'd start coughing up blood, and at that point, you were basically dead within 24 hours. The Plague of Justinian killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people, roughly half of Europe's population at the time. The response back then was to flee the cities, which spread the disease faster, or to pray for divine intervention, which obviously did nothing. Fun fact, the Byzantines were so overwhelmed with corpses that they ran out of burial space and started piling bodies into the towers of the city walls. Black Death. Now we get to the big one, the Black Death, which hit Europe between 1346 and 1353. This is the same bacterium as the Plague of Justinian, Yersinia pestis, but this outbreak was even worse, killing somewhere between 75 and 200 million people across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. If you caught the bubonic form, you'd experience the same horrific buboes, black, swollen, and oozing. But the Black Death came in 3 flavors, bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic, and each one killed you in a different way. The septicemic form happens when the bacteria gets into your bloodstream. Your skin would turn black due to tissue death and internal bleeding, hence the name, and you die within hours.
Sometimes before you even knew you were sick, the pneumonic form was airborne, and the most terrifying, you'd cough up up bloody mucus, your lungs would fill with fluid, and you'd essentially drown in your own body within 2 or 3 days. Survival rate was nearly zero. People back then thought the plague was caused by bad air called miasma, or by the wrath of God. So they did things like ringing church bells non-stop, burning incense in the streets, and most tragically, they blamed Jewish communities for poisoning wells, leading to massacres across Europe. Groups of flagellants would whip themselves bloody and travel from town to town, spreading the disease even faster. The rats and fleas that were actually carrying the bacteria went completely unnoticed. Great Plague of London. The Black Death never really left Europe, and it came back in waves for centuries. One of the worst returns was the Great Plague of London in 1665, which killed about 100,000 people, roughly a quarter of London's population, in just 18 months. The symptoms were the same: bubonic plague, horror, buboes, fever, vomiting, and that telltale ring of dead skin that inspired the rhyme, "Ring around the rosy," though historians actually debate that connection. If you'd lived in London during this time, you'd see red crosses painted on the doors of infected houses with the words, "Lord have mercy upon us," and guards would lock entire families inside their homes to die together. Officials hired plague doctors who wore those iconic Beak masks stuffed with herbs because they believed the disease traveled through smell, which was completely wrong. The plague only ended after the Great Fire of London in 1666, which destroyed huge parts of the city and apparently killed off enough rats to stop the spread. Cocoliztli and smallpox in the New World. While Europe was dealing with the plague, the Americas were about to experience something even worse. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 1500s, they brought smallpox, measles, typhus, and influenza, none of which the indigenous populations had any immunity to. If you were an Aztec or Inca, catching smallpox would mean a high fever, severe back pain, and within a few days, a rash that turned into thousands of pus-filled blisters covering your entire body, including the soles of your feet and inside your mouth. The pain was so intense that victims couldn't move, couldn't eat, and couldn't be touched. Many died of dehydration before the disease itself killed them. Then there was Cocoliztli, a mysterious disease that hit Mexico in 1545 and 1576. Modern research suggests it was likely a hemorrhagic fever caused by Salmonella enterica. Victims would bleed from their eyes, nose, and mouth and develop massive black tongues. Death came within 3 or 4 days, and the disease killed an estimated 15 million people, which was about 80% of the native population at the time. The combined effect of these epidemics was catastrophic. Some estimates suggest up to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died within a century, mostly from disease. The Spanish often interpreted this as a sign that God favored their conquest, which is a horrifying belief to hold while watching entire civilizations collapse. Cholera pandemics. Jumping forward to the 1800s, we get the cholera pandemics. There have been 7 major cholera pandemics since 1817, and the disease is still around today. Cholera is caused by the Vibrio cholerae bacterium, usually spread through contaminated water. If you caught it, you'd suddenly start producing massive amounts of watery diarrhea, described by doctors as rice water. You could lose up to 20 liters of fluid in a single day. Your eyes would sink into your skull, your skin would turn blue, gray from dehydration, and your hands and feet would shrivel up like raisins. Death often came within hours from severe dehydration and shock. The cruel thing about cholera is that the treatment is incredibly simple: rehydration with clean water and salts. But for most of the 1800s, nobody believed it was waterborne. In 1854, a London doctor named John Snow proved that a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street was causing an outbreak, but his findings were largely ignored for years because the medical establishment was still committed to the miasma theory, the idea that disease was caused by bad smells. How many people died because of that stubbornness is honestly impossible to calculate. Spanish flu in 1918. Right as World War I was ending, the Spanish flu hit, and it became the deadliest pandemic in modern history, killing somewhere between 50 and 100 million people worldwide in just 2 years. If you caught it, you'd start with normal flu symptoms: fever, aches, cough, but then it would escalate fast. Within hours, your face could turn a deep mahogany blue from lack of oxygen, and your lungs would fill with a thick, bloody fluid. Victims described feeling like they were being drowned from the inside.
The strangest thing about the Spanish flu is that it killed young, healthy adults at much higher rates than children or the elderly, because their stronger immune systems would overreact and basically destroy their own lungs in something called a cytokine storm. And yet, during all of this, governments around the world censored news of the pandemic because of the war effort. Cities held massive parades to sell war bonds, even as doctors begged them not to, and people were told that wearing masks was a sign of cowardice. The disease was actually first identified in Kansas, USA, not Spain. It only got that name because Spain was neutral in the war and actually reported on it honestly. Honest opinion. Now, here's the part I want to be straight about with you. Every single one of these plagues could have been so much less devastating if people had been willing to question what they believed. Almost every major plague in history was made worse by false beliefs. The Athenians crowded into temples to pray and made the spread worse. The Romans persecuted Christians instead of treating the sick. Medieval Europeans massacred Jewish communities and whipped themselves through the streets while ignoring the actual rats. Spanish colonizers saw indigenous deaths as divine approval, and the British medical establishment ignored Jon Snow for years because they were emotionally attached to the miasma theory. Even when Ignaz Semmelweis proved in the 1840s that doctors washing their hands could save the lives of mothers giving birth, he was mocked, driven out of his profession, and died in an asylum. The simple truth is that humans throughout history have consistently chosen comfortable beliefs over uncomfortable evidence, and that choice has killed hundreds of millions of people. We love to think we'd be different if we lived back then, but the same patterns repeat with every new outbreak. And if you like this video, subscribe for similar ones, or join my Discord to suggest another.